I have told you guys repeatedly that I believe the most important race happening in Washington state is the race for King County prosecutor. Because I think it has an opportunity to set the tone for the criminal justice system, for reforming the criminal justice system in a way that actually holds people accountable. And really, right now, it's in disarray. I mean, we have these massive case backlogs, victims aren't getting justice. And I think accountability and justice are key for turning our public safety crisis around. So the two candidates in this race are both Democrats. Jim Ferrell is the mayor of Federal Way. We've had him on the show before. He and some other mayors south of Seattle have spoken out about the crime crisis. And then Lisa Mannion, she is the current chief of staff for the current prosecuting attorney, Dan Satterberg, who is retiring. So I have invited both of them on the show. I've not heard back from Lisa Mannion's campaign. I did, however, speak at length with Jim Ferrell about his campaign and about what changes he would make as the elected prosecutor to our system of justice. Jim, welcome back to Undivided. For folks who aren't familiar with you, give them the cliff notes of who you are.
You bet. Currently, I'm the mayor of Federal Way. I was a King County prosecutor for 16 years, a city of Renton prosecutor before that. Grew up in a small town of Yelm, Washington, where the tallest building in town was a water tower. I walked on to the University of Washington football program at UW. So I was a Husky and played for the legendary Don James. Law school at Gonzaga, city prosecutor for 3 years, father of a 15-year-old, and married for 24 years.
It's an easy question. I guess you probably answered it a million times. Why are you running to be the next King County prosecutor?
I actually really believe, and as many of our neighbors do, that there is a true crisis of public safety in our region. And I think I'm uniquely qualified with my background, not only as a mayor of a city of 100,000 people, but also someone with 19 years of criminal prosecutor experience. And I believe that experience, in addition to my executive leadership and all the connections and endorsements and support I have, I think maybe make me uniquely qualified to address the challenges of the criminal justice system now and to help make our community safer.
This is an interesting position because when people get in it, they stay in it for a very long time. As you know,
Right.
I hadn't heard this stat, but something like only 5 people have held the seat in the last 7 decades. Why do you think it is that people get the seat and they stay in it?
It's actually Brandi. It's 4 people. It
Only
was
four? Okay.
There was a legendary UW football All-American football player named Chuck Carroll that was the prosecutor from 49 to 70. Then Chris Bailey from 70 to 78, Norm Mailing from 79 to 2007 when he tragically passed, and now Dan Satterberg for the past 15 years. And I think that this is really one of the critical. Who also occupied the position just for 2 very short years, from 34 to 36, was none other than Warren G. Magnuson. Maggie was the King County prosecutor before he was a United States congressman. So I can tell you that this position is really the hinge point of the entire criminal justice system. And while the city of Seattle attorney handles misdemeanors and all of that, this is really the DA position, as you know, for really the 13th largest county in the country, and by size of DA's office, I think it's the 10th largest prosecutor's offices in the country. So it's really one of the major offices in the country.
I want to get something out of the way quick. You're a Democrat. You're running
Yes.
as a Democrat, although does it say D on the ballot? I can't remember.
No,
It's
it's a nonpartisan race, and
nonpartisan.
yeah.
But you've opened up campaign ads saying, I'm Jim Ferrell and I'm a Democrat. You didn't used to be a Democrat. You were a Republican up until 2012, I think. Why'd you change?
Well, there were a lot of thought went into that. I talked to my wife about it for many years. It's one of those things where I consider myself very much a moderate, a pro law enforcement, pro safety. But with regard to issues like labor, I was the president of my labor union at the prosecutor's office for 2 years. Labor, environment, energy issues, just a variety of issues in which I felt that perhaps that my political positions very much lined up more with the Democratic Party than with the Republican Party. And I think I put a great deal of thought into it. I also did at a time in 2012 in which I wasn't running for an office. It was just a very principled decision. And if anybody would like to see the process I went through, I put it in an article in an op-ed back in April, I believe, of 2012.
Some have opined that you did it because you realized that it was going to become harder to win as a Democrat in King County. State Rep Jesse Johnson, who was behind all of the police reform legislation, said as much. He thinks you're a Republican in Democrat clothing. What would you be your response to folks who believe that?
Well, I was involved in the Democratic Party long before Jesse Johnson got involved. I was an elected Democratic Precinct Committee officer for the past 10 years. I've been a three-time elected mayor, and every time I ran, I was supported by the Democratic Party. I really felt like when I was watching I was very involved politically for the past 30 years and worked in Olympia, both as a staffer, but also a little bit as a lobbyist as well for the trial lawyers. And I put a great deal of thought in regard to where I wanted to align myself. I wanted to make sure that it was completely separated from any sort of political campaign. And I really believe that it's very important to stake out where you're at ideologically and to run positions, through a well thought out, political, philosophy, and that's really where I came from, in this. And so, people could say what they want to say, but the proof is in the pudding. I've been very involved, politically in federal way for several decades now, and very open about where I'm at. And I'll tell you where I'm not at. I'm not at where we should overly restrict the ability of law enforcement to do its job, or to pseudo legalize drugs. And I think that's where the disagreements have been with the party, but that's fine. I think there is great merit to the fact that this position should be nonpartisan, and I'm very proud to have both Democrats and Republicans, business and labor, support this campaign, because everybody deserves to be safe and to feel safe.
Yeah, and ultimately on the show, we care about your ideas before your identity. And so, I mean, political labels don't matter too terribly much to me. In that regard, like you said, you've worked in the King County Prosecutor's Office. What do you think has gone wrong? I mean, assuming you believe it has gone wrong in that office over the past few years.
Well, I think that ultimately there have been several things that have appeared in the Seattle Times, and in media just recently about I would say, the deteriorating state of morale in the office. One need only look at the Seattle Times op-ed yesterday's paper, about comments that were made by my opponent comparing, when trying to address the fact that she had never had one criminal trial and never had a caseload. She likened herself to Jeff Bezos and said that he doesn't slap labels on boxes or drive the trucks. And that was incredibly offensive to the people that do the work in that office. And that has played itself out in the media. But even before then, I think, there have been quite a number of departures, really almost an exodus out of the office, for really, I think, a loss of a sense of mission, a concern about morale, a concern about really a lack of focus, and definitely a lack of focus on victims. And so that's why I think it's unheard of in the stable position that this has been over the decades for people like Mark Larson, who was the chief criminal deputy for over 2 decades, to come out and endorse me, as well as like people currently in the office, like James Wisman, who's led the appellate unit there for 25 years and in the office for 32 years, as well as Scott O'Toole, homicide prosecutor, has been over there 30 years. So these individuals have really put themselves out there and said this matters. Ultimately, I think that where Dan Satterberg, the current prosecutor, and the chief of staff really have veered off course, is really just a lack of focus and there's been a real rift between law enforcement and the communities they serve, that the prosecutor serves. And that's why one only needs to take a look at my endorsements from the 15 current mayors and 3 or 4 prior mayors in King County. And there's just been this chasm, a schism, if you will, between the King County Prosecutor's Office and law enforcement in the cities. And in large part has to do with how cases are filed, but also I think just in a manner in which the lack of respect and lack of communication from that office.
Explain more what you mean by a lack of focus from Dan Satterberg and that office. I guess, what do you want to bring back in focus that you feel like they haven't focused on appropriately?
Well, I think, for years, I led a coalition of South King County mayors, even before the pandemic in 2019, where, the the mayors and the police chiefs in South and East King County met with the leadership of the prosecutor's office. I helped sort of guide those discussions, and we were concerned about filing standards, about when cases were filed, how they were filed, either the monetary standards, or whether it's burglaries or assaults against officers, and those type of things that made us very concerned about the manner in which the cases were being handled. And then I think what really accelerated this concerns, and frankly what got me into this race, was an astounding decision to launch restorative community pathways, the so-called juvenile justice program, with zero oversight, well, no notice to the cities whatsoever. In fact, we had a Zoom meeting with the King County leadership of the prosecutor's office, the executive, and many of these cities in South King County to address ongoing crime. And we had just recently, before that, been made aware of a proposed plan called Restorative Community Pathways. We had received no notice about this, and during the meeting, we found out not only was it already in place, it had been in place for 6 weeks. So that really shocked us, and I really felt like change was needed at that time, and that includes crimes that are eligible for that program are residential burglary, commercial burglary, bringing a gun to school, felony assault, robbery. No case number, no judge, no check back, no oversight, other than just referral to a community group. And it's just not appropriate. And that's been a real flashpoint in the campaign.
And articulate further what you would change then if you were the King County prosecutor, because, I think that juvenile detention obviously has become controversial. And most reasonable people, I think, realize that young kids do deserve a chance to be able to put their life back on track. But kind of where is that fine line for you?
Well, definitely. I mean, I'm a father of a 15-year-old, and we certainly want to make sure that we give, young people an opportunity to course correct if they've made a mistake and when they've made a mistake. And the goal is not to have them come back, not to be so punitive that we, extinguish their hope or damage them, career-wise and opportunity-wise down the road. But for the felonies that I mentioned, there have to be consequences. But I don't think it's asking too much to have a case number. There's a whole discussion right now occurring about pre-filing diversion or pre-trial diversion. Now, the problem with the manner in which it's being run right now in pre-filing is, once again, no case number, no judge, no probation officer. So they've cut out the judiciary, they've cut out King County probation, they've cut out really the institutions that really make sure or are transparency and accountability checks. So you've got to have measures that will ensure transparency and accountability. Those include the ability to track meaningful reports back. I do believe that it's critically important to have a judicial actor, a judge. Only a lawyer would call a judge a judicial actor. You need to have a judge in the process, right? The beginning and the end, and have a report back. And that report back that should be, pushed through King County probation should say, hey, did the young person show up? Did they do what was asked? What were they asked to do? How many times did they show up? Did they complete the program? And did they commit any other law violations? At the end of a certain time, the group that's getting taxpayer money needs to send a report back, say those things, and then the judge dismisses the case if you've got compliance. If not, maybe you've got a bigger problem, and we need to drill down on that and address that. But right now, none of those earmarks of transparency and accountability are there, and that's not a justice system. That's not a diversion program. That's a look in the other way program.
One of the biggest issues you're going to face day one, if you're elected, is a case backlog. The city attorney, Ann Davison in Seattle, dealt with that. I think she had 5,000 cases staring her in the face when she took office. So how do you even begin to triage that? What's your plan for triage?
Triage is the name of the game. And well, it's, first of all, it's not a game, but it's that is the what is absolutely essential. Now, the main difference about what happened there are two main differences between the city of Seattle and the King County Prosecutor's Office. The first is those cases that Ann was dealing with in Seattle had not been filed yet. Now, that's critical because that differs on how you handle them. But they were also misdemeanors or gross misdemeanors. Now, with a misdemeanor is 90 days maximum. A gross misdemeanor like a DUI or an assault or theft, those are maximum 364 days, so essentially a year. The key issue with regard to misdemeanors is they have statute limitations, a year for a misdemeanor, 2 years for a gross misdemeanor, which means that many of those cases in those triage analysis were coming up on statute limitations. In the 4,500 case backlog now, I'm told, and I need to get my arms around exactly what's going on in the office when I get there and during the transition. I'm told that these cases in large part are already filed. But so that makes this issue, when you go to triage, a bandwidth issue. How do you push those cases through a bandwidth when you only have a certain capacity and you've got speedy trial considerations? So yes, an aggressive, well thought out triage will need to occur. Out of those 4,500, you've got roughly 500 sexual assaults, 180 murders. Those must, and any gun related crimes must go through at first. And then I think you've got to expand the bandwidth. That's both with prosecutors, but you probably need to bring in some other judicial actors, judges. You need to bring in some pro tems, retired judges, and make sure that you're pushing those cases through, get them to resolution. In regard to backlog, now you usually have a certain number of pending cases anyway. Murder cases and serious cases take a long time to get through the system. That's not a backlog. But really, with regard to backlog, you've got to get that down to as close to zero as possible. Now, difficult decisions are going to have to be made to get us to the point where we can, get to zero. And but we've got to do this in the next year. We've got to act with a sense of urgency, and I think ultimately that's really what has been missing from this analysis is a sense of urgency, and we're going to get this accomplished. We have to. The system is starting to buckle under this pressure.
When you say difficult decisions are going to have to be made, I'm assuming that means dropping some cases or pleading people out.
Yeah. On the low end of those, we've got to get to zero, and I think those, this leadership position, that's what Ann had to do. Now, those were misdemeanor cases, and we'll have to take a very close look at which cases we're talking about. But I think this is a really historic anomaly that has to be addressed, and we can't limp our way through this. We've got to have some bold, decisive action to be able to really start moving forward.
I want to ask you about something that bothers me. I'm going to give you my opinion on it. You don't have to share my opinion. You can disagree with my opinion. But you mentioned the three types of cases that would need to be triaged: sexual assault, homicide, and gun crimes. I'm glad you mentioned gun crimes because I have a big issue with how they're dealt with. We hear a lot of Democrats say, oh, gun violence, gun violence, gun violence, trying to restrict Second Amendment rights. But then I look at these cases that involve guns, actual criminals who use guns to commit crimes. Whether it be a robbery or a drive-by shooting or something like that. And then they get plea deals. And I guess it bothers me to see criminals who use guns get plea deals when there's this huge focus on reducing gun violence and Second Amendment rights. So I guess what would you weigh when you have a criminal who's committed a crime with a gun, allegedly? What do you weigh in deciding whether to give them a plea deal, or should you be throwing the book at every single one of them?
Well, you can't be indiscriminate. I mean, I think the key thing is in dealing with these cases, and I was in the homicide and violent crime unit. I went out to homicide scenes. I think there are a number of different factors when you take a look at a case, and you've got to make sure that you've got really well-experienced and well-trained deputies in your office and great leadership. I'm concerned right now. I'm going to get to your question, but I want to say something first. I'm concerned about the way the office has deployed and arranged and staff the office in regard to who's actually trying these cases. And I think a real reset, a reorganization needs to occur in the office to make sure that cases are getting to trial. We at the King County Prosecutor's Office, and I was there for 16 years, prided ourselves on being an office of trial attorneys. That ethos has gone away. There also used to be a very strong concern for victims' feelings about resolutions of the case. So to answer your question, first and foremost, we want to talk to victims and figure out where they're at. But we have our own independent analysis about, is the individual dangerous? By definition of using a firearm, it checks that box. But, is there an injury? Are we talking about, a 15-year-old kid popping off a few rounds as going down the street in what would be in that situation, a drive-by shooting, but were there any strikes? Or did anybody get hit? Any property get hit? I think you need to take a look at the background of the individual. Have there been priors with firearms? Have there been violent crimes before? Where is this person at? Whenever I used to deal with cases, and I had thousands of cases, right, that I dealt with, either filing them, being in trial, thousands of decisions and arguments on bail. just a really sort of reservoir of information I have in regard to where people are at on a spectrum. You really just have to ask yourself, where is this person at? Are they just getting started, or that, I mean, is this something in which a young person with a bright future got in the wrong car with the wrong kids, or is this the driver of that car that's done this over and over and over? And where we're at in that process, and that's why negotiations are important. It's very important to listen to the defense attorneys and the defense investigators. What I loved about working in the prosecutor's office before is our only consideration. Brandi, nobody ever kept track of win or loss, ever. And if you ever hear about a prosecutor keep track of their win-loss record, that should be a red flag. That person doesn't know what they're doing or why they're in the business. The only thing that matters is doing the right thing and finding justice. And so where do you find that person? Where do the equities lie? How many priors? How serious are the damages or the injury? Did somebody die? Did somebody get seriously injured? Those are factors that must be weighed.
Yeah, because I think that, and I agree that I don't think everyone needs the book thrown at them. And there's certainly a variety of factors to, as you say, get to what is justice look like in this case. But I think when you have this huge focus among Democratic politicians of gun control, you have law-abiding gun owners who are frustrated when they see just deals being handed out like candy to criminals who commit crimes with a gun. And so as you face low staffing, these huge case backlogs, are you going to be just kind of offering plea deals to everyone to get cases off your plate?
Well, that's why it's imperative that the backlog be eliminated and get down to zero as much as possible. I always, as a city prosecutor and as a county prosecutor, I always believed it was critically important to be intellectually honest with each and every case, address each and every case, and seek justice in those cases. You can't give somebody a deal simply because there are other systemic forces. That's a failure of justice. It's a failure to the victim. What you need to do is make sure that you've got things set up in such a way in which you have the ability to make principled decisions based on conduct. You also do want to make sure that you can get people course corrected, but where you've got individuals that are dangerous, that have shown themselves to have a propensity to violence and have done it previously, they need to be held fully accountable. I can tell you one of the things that really surprised me when I became mayor was the 3:00 in the morning phone call from the police chief. And invariably, if something happens in the city of Federal Way, it doesn't matter what day it is, it doesn't matter what holiday it is or what time it is, I will get a phone call. Oftentimes, when the chief is telling me about a situation, a shooting, a homicide, something unfortunate that's occurred in our community, an apartment building fire, I will go out to those scenes. But when I talk to the chief, one of my first questions is, did we find the gun? And when I first started, the chief would be like, what? He wouldn't know to ask the detective or the commander who told him about this. But what I knew was, if you found the firearm, there is a firearm enhancement that can be added to the case. And that's always been a priority of mine to make sure. And we want to make sure if a gun was used in the commission of a crime, that we find that gun and get it off the streets. So I think that's very important to make sure that you're fully holding people accountable for gun violence, and that you're tracking down those guns and doing the best you can to make sure that our community is safe. When guns show up at school, it's a very serious matter, and we need to do everything we can about it.
As we wind down here, the criminal justice system is a big entity with a lot of moving parts. A new prosecutor, if that's you, can't fix everything. There are things that are out of your control. What lawmakers decide to do in Olympia is out of your control. How judges decide to do when it comes to bail for violent or repeat offenders is out of your control ultimately. How do you work around some of those other challenges that the system is faced with right now, things that aren't in your control?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I am a big believer of the independence of the judiciary. I mean, we do want to make sure that that judges have the intellectual freedom to and the incredibly important and serious role of making independent decisions. The best we can do is make the best case before the court, and then they're in the position to decide and to weigh. With regard to the legislature, the legendary Norm Mailing was a frequent appearance, made frequent appearances in the legislature, and was a leader on those issues. Whether it was first, combating drug violence in the '80s, And then, 10 years later, going back down there and getting those laws adjusted, or going back down to Olympia and addressing car theft, where we used to have, one of the leading car theft areas in the country, 15,000 car thefts a year. But by focusing in on multipliers and getting the law changed, we dropped that number in half. And so I think that we need to make sure that we have a prosecutor that has a presence in Olympia, and working with other elected officials and prosecutors to say, we need to make sure that police officers can pursue stolen cars and other crimes. We need to make sure that there's clear lines in regard to drugs, and that there should not be a state of de facto legalization for cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl. Some common sense laws, and that's really, I think, actually, there's a very important role the prosecutor can play, as an advocate, as an ally, and really as an expert, to be able to go down there and say, hey, this is really our perspective. And by our, I meaning law enforcement, prosecutors, and the community.
Yeah, and not to be afraid to speak up and push back. And you've shown that in your job as mayor. I've had you on the show before with other mayors to talk about that. Ending here, I mean, there's a million things I could talk to you about, because I've said that I think this is the most critical race when it comes to the direction of King County and of our state. Your opponent, in trying to kind of counter the narrative that she has no criminal trial experience, she said, and you alluded to her statement, but she said that voters aren't hiring her to be in a courtroom. They're hiring her to set the tone of the office. Right. So if we're to believe that, if voters are hiring you to set the tone of the office, what tone would Jim Ferrell set as the King County prosecutor?
It's a great question. I want to let you know that, we have precious time in that TV ad that I ran, 30 seconds. And what do you say in 30 seconds that can really convey to people that I have the knowledge and experience and really the understanding on how to address these cases? This isn't about the technical issue about trying a case. I mean, I think that what she was saying is that the prosecutor's job isn't to try cases per se, and that there's other things to it. But by handling those thousands upon thousands of cases and working with the victims, standing in front of a judge, standing in front of countless juries, looking into the faces of victims and the families of victims, and understanding, what trial attorneys go through, it is grueling work. It is heartbreaking work. It's really critically important. And I think when most people think of this office, they think about the handling of those criminal cases, which touch people sometimes at their absolute worst moments in their life, both for victims, defendants. So you really want somebody that has gone through this, that understands what this is all about. And this isn't about policy. It's really about handling crime, and crime tears at the very fabric of our community. And you need somebody who understands that, will hold individuals accountable, will seek justice for victims, will seek to make sure that individuals that appear in court don't come back, and where possible, help them get rehabilitated. But when that's not possible, hold them fully accountable.
Jim Ferrell, we appreciate it. Good luck to you. Just about a week out, so I'm sure that's nerve-wracking. Maybe you've been through this and it's not nerve-wracking to you, but I appreciate you taking the time to join us, and obviously we'll be following this race to see what happens.
Thank you very much, Brandi. Appreciate it for having me.